As you will all know, the American frontier empire was built largely by slave labor. As we don't always remember, it was precisely that model of frontier colonialism, of a frontier empire built by slave labor, that was admired by Adolf Hitler. When Adolf Hitler spoke about the United States, it was generally, before the war at least, with admiration. And it was a question for Hitler, who will the racial inferiors be? Who will the slaves be in the German Eastern Empire? And the answer that he gave, both in Mein Kampf and in the second book, and in practice in the invasion of 1941, the answer was the Ukrainians.
皆さん、こんにちは。ウクライナ戦争が起きた後、ウクライナの民族主義という話がトピックの一つになっています。ウクライナのネオナチは行き過ぎた民族主義と考える人もいます。最近、ある人のウクライナのネオナチに関する見解を聞きました。ウクライナ人がもともと白人至上主義的な思想を持っていたからではなく、今まで様々な残酷なことを経験してきて、自分たちが生きるためにネオナチと呼ばれようが、極右と呼ばれようが関係ない。イデオロギーではなく、最も強くなり、自分の大切な家族を守ることを追求した結果の選択であるという見解です。もちろん、このような見解で、彼らのすべての行動を正当化できないが、ウクライナの歴史を知った上で考えると、そういう見解が出てくるのもおかしくないと思いました。今回皆さんに紹介する話は、アメリカの歴史学者、ティモーシー・スナイダーが2017年、ドイツでのある学術会議で話した内容です。彼の専門は近代ナショナリズム史、中東欧史です。彼はヨーロッパの11カ国の言語を理解するため、一次資料に基づいて研究活動を行っています。彼の奥さんも同じ大学で研究を行う東ヨーロッパ史の専門家です。彼は2017年に日本に行って、日本のいくつかの大学でも講演をしました。近年、ウクライナ情勢についても多く発言しています。彼はこの講演で、第二次世界大戦について研究するなら、ウクライナから始めなければ意味がないと主張しており、ヒトラーが戦争を起こしたことと、ウクライナとの関係性などについて話をします。ウクライナのことについて今まで教科書や他のところでもあまり見ない話です。ですので、それに同意しない人も多くいるかもしれませんが、この視点はウクライナのことを知りたいと思っている人にとって斬新な視点になると思います。では、どうぞ。
The Ukrainians were to be at the center of a project of colonization and enslavement. The Ukrainians were to be treated as Afrikaner or as Nega. The word was very often used, as those of you who read German documents from the war will know. By analogy with the United States, the idea was to create a slavery-driven, exterminatory colonial regime in Eastern Europe, where the center was going to be Ukraine. Now, you have been told many times what results from this. So let me just briefly summarize. The point of the Second World War, from Hitler's point of view, the purpose of the Second World War, from Hitler's point of view, was the conquest of Ukraine. It is therefore senseless to commemorate, to remember any part of the Second World War without beginning from Ukraine. Any commemoration of the Second World War that involves the Nazi purposes, the ideological, economic, and political purposes of the Nazi regime must begin precisely from Ukraine. Now, this is not only a matter of theory, this is a matter of practice. German policies, the policies that we remember, all of them focused precisely on Ukraine. The Hunger Plan, with its notion that tens of millions, 10 Millionen, people were going to starve in the winter of 1941. Generalplan Ost, with its idea that millions more people would be forcibly transported or killed in the 5, 10, or 15 years to follow. But also the final solution, Hitler's idea of the elimination of Jews. All of these policies hung together in theory and practice with the idea of an invasion of the Soviet Union, the major goal of which would be the conquest of Ukraine. The result of this ideology, the result of this war, I thought Germans were taller than this. I'm stooping all the time. It's not my bad posture, it's the microphone. I want you to hear me. The result of all of this, the result of this ideology and of this war was that some 3.5 million inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine, 3.5 million inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine, civilians, were victims of German killing policies between 1941 and 1945. In addition to that 3.5 million, about 3 million Ukrainians, inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine, died as soldiers in the Red Army or died indirectly as a consequence of the war. Now, these numbers are numbers for inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine alone. Of course, the numbers are greater when one includes the entire Soviet Union. But it's worth being specific here about the difference between Ukraine and the rest of the Soviet Union for two reasons. The first is Ukraine was the major war aim. Ukraine was the center of Hitler's ideological colonialism. But beyond that, in practice, all of Soviet Ukraine was occupied for most of the war, which is why for Ukrainians today, war is something that happens here as opposed to elsewhere. Hitler never planned to conquer any more than 10% of Soviet Russia. And in practice, German armies never occupied more than 5% of Soviet Russia, and that for a relatively brief period of time. Now, Russians suffered in the Second World War in a way that is unthinkable to West Europeans, in a way that is unthinkable even for Germans. But nevertheless, when we think about the Soviet Union, the place of the Soviet Ukraine is very special, even by comparison to Soviet Russia. In absolute numbers, more inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine die in the Second World War than inhabitants of Soviet Russia. In absolute terms. And these are the calculations of Russian historians. In absolute terms, which means in relative terms, in proportional terms, Ukraine was far, far, far more at risk than Soviet Russia during the war. The Holocaust is integrally and organically connected to the Vernichtungskrieg, to the war in 1941. It is organically and integrally connected to the attempt to conquer Ukraine. This is true in three ways. The first is Ukraine is the cause of the war. Had Hitler not had the colonial idea to fight a war in Eastern Europe to control Ukraine, had there not been that plan, there could not have been a Holocaust, because it is that plan that brings German power into Eastern Europe where the Jews live. Secondly, the actual war in Ukraine brings the Wehrmacht, brings the SS, brings the German police to the places where Jews could be killed, which is the third point, the methods. It became clear to Germans in 1941 that something like a Holocaust could be perpetrated because of massacres in places like Kamyanets-Podilsky, or more notoriously Babi Yar on the edge of Kiev. It was there that for the first time, not only in the history of the war, but for the first time in the history of humanity, tens of thousands of people were killed by bullets in a continuous large-scale massacre. It was events like this on the territory of Ukraine precisely that made it clear that something like a Holocaust could happen. What does this mean? It means that for every German who takes seriously the idea of responsibility for the Holocaust must also take seriously the history of the German occupation of Ukraine. Or to put it a different way, taking seriously the history of the German occupation of Ukraine is one way to take seriously the history of the Holocaust. Now, how do we evaluate the question of German responsibility? What about the Ukrainians themselves? Shouldn't Ukrainians themselves be carrying out discussions about what happened in occupied Ukraine during the Second World War? Isn't Ukrainian nationalism also a theme that should be discussed? Of course it is. I made my entire career writing about Ukrainian nationalism. That's why I can be introduced as a professor at Yale University, because I wrote about Ukrainian nationalism, because I wrote about Ukrainian nationalists and the ethnic cleansing of Poles in 1943, because I published the first article in a Western language about the role of the Ukrainian police in the Holocaust and how that led to the ethnic cleansing of Poles in 1943. The Ukrainian nationalism is a real historical tendency, and it ought to be studied judiciously, as some members of the audience here have done better and more recently than I. But if we are speaking not in Kiev, but in Berlin, if we are speaking of German historical responsibility, we have to recognize that Ukrainian nationalism is one consequence of the German war in Eastern Europe. Ukrainian nationalism was a relatively minor force in interwar Poland. It was paid by the German Abwehr, as I'm sure many of you will know. Ukrainian nationalists in Polish prison were released precisely because Germany invaded Poland in 1939. When Germany and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Poland in 1939, destroying the Polish state, this also destroyed all of the legal political parties, including the legal Ukrainian parties, which had, up until that point were much more important than Ukrainian nationalists. When we think about the German occupation of Ukraine, we have to remember some very simple, banal points that often escape our attention. Like, for example, there was no particular correlation between nationality and collaboration. Russians collaborated, Crimean Tatars collaborated, Belarusians collaborated. Everyone collaborated. There is no, as far as we can tell, correlation between ethnicity and collaboration, with the partial exception of the Volksdeutsch, of course. But in general, there's no correlation between ethnicity and collaboration. Something else to remember. The majority, probably the vast majority of people who collaborated with the German occupation were not politically motivated. They were collaborating with an occupation that was there and an occupation that is a German historical responsibility. Something that is never said, because it's inconvenient for precisely no one, for precisely everyone, is that more Ukrainian communists collaborated with the Germans than did Ukrainian nationalists. This doesn't make sense, and so no one ever says it, but it is precisely the case. Vastly more members of the Communist Party collaborated with the German occupation than did Ukrainian nationalists. And for that matter, very many of the people who collaborated with the German occupation had collaborated with Soviet policies in the 1930s. These points, although they're very basic and they're completely obvious if you think about them, are typical of Ukrainian history. They're typical of the fact that Ukraine was ruled first as part of the Soviet Union, and then under an incredibly bloody and devastating German occupation. When we think about the way that occupation ended, we often overlook certain basic points, like this. Far, far more Ukrainians died fighting against the Wehrmacht than fighting on the side of the Wehrmacht. Incomparably more Ukrainians died fighting against the Wehrmacht than on the side of the Wehrmacht. Which is not something that one can say about every country that's considered an ally. It's not something that one can say, for example, about France, which is why there's no official French history of the Second World War, and why there will never be an official French history of the Second World War, even under Macron. There are some things that Macron cannot do, and one of them will be this. He will not write the official history of the Second World War in France, because more French soldiers fought on the Axis side than on the Allied side. Now, more Ukrainians, okay, you didn't think that was as funny as I did, all right. More Ukrainians fought on the Allied side died on the Allied side than French. More Ukrainians fought and died on the Allied side than British. More Ukrainians fought and died on the Allied side than Americans. More Ukrainians fought and died on the Allied side than French, British, and Americans put together. Why do we not see this, or why do Germans not always see this? Because we forget that Ukrainians were fighting in the Red Army. We confuse the Red Army with a Russian army, which it most definitely was not. The Red Army was the army of the Soviet Union, in which Ukrainians, because of the geography of the war, were substantially overrepresented.
時間の関係上、すべての内容を翻訳することができず、重要な部分だけを翻訳しました。元動画のリンクを説明欄に入れておきますので、ご興味がある方はご確認ください。これからもこのような話をしていきますので、ぜひフォロー、 コメント、拡散をお願いします。また、このチャンネルを応援していただける方は、ぜひメンバーシップもご検討ください。では、また次回お会いしましょう。ハラノタイムズがお届けしました。